The courtroom victory that destroyed everything until her father walked in. The judge's gavel hung in the air, seconds from sealing the verdict, when Matthew's lips curled into a satisfied smirk. His eyes drifted across the courtroom to his soon-to-be ex-wife, Rebecca, hunched in her chair like a wounded animal. Victory tasted sweet on his tongue. He'd hired the most cutthroat attorney money could afford, cleverly concealed every valuable asset, and masterfully painted her as mentally unstable before the court. This wasn't just winning, this was total domination. Freedom was within reach, along with every last dollar of his carefully guarded fortune. Matthew turned toward his lawyer, hand raised for a celebratory high five, when suddenly the massive oak doors exploded open at the courtroom's rear. The temperature plummeted. A figure emerged from the doorway. Matthew had never laid eyes on this man before, yet his mere presence made the judge visibly stiffen. Matthew remained blissfully unaware that his celebration was about to transform into the complete annihilation of everything he'd built. Courtroom 4B carried the distinctive aroma of industrial floor cleaner mixed with decades of broken dreams and desperate pleas. But to Matthew Reynolds, it smelled like expensive champagne and absolute triumph. He made a show of adjusting his custom-tailored Italian suit sleeves, deliberately catching light on his platinum timepiece, a calculated move designed to remind everyone present, particularly the woman seated across from him, that he existed beyond their reach. Matthew reclined confidently in his leather seat, crossing one leg casually over the other. His attorney, Richard Price, methodically organized documents with the practiced precision of a Vegas dealer sweeping chips off the table. Richard embodied ruthlessness wrapped in expensive fabric, a legal assassin commanding $1,000 every 60 minutes to systematically destroy people's lives. Matthew considered every cent an investment in guaranteed destruction. "Stay calm, Matthew," Richard murmured without lifting his eyes from the paperwork spread before him. "We've boxed them into a corner. The prenuptial agreement has zero vulnerabilities, and her emotional breakdown during last month's deposition accomplished exactly what we intended. She appeared hysterical and completely incapable of managing financial matters." Matthew released a low, throaty chuckle. "Worried? Hardly, Richard. I'm savoring every second of this. Just look at her state." He gestured subtly toward the opposing table. Rebecca sat motionless, appearing more diminished than Matthew had ever witnessed during their years together. She wore an unremarkable gray dress that screamed discount department store, a stark contrast to the designer garments he once draped over her when she served as his perfect accessory. Her dark hair was severely pulled into a tight bun, and her shoulders collapsed inward as though supporting an invisible crushing weight. She radiated defeat and brokenness. Matthew felt satisfaction surge through his veins. This was the inevitable consequence of challenging him. Rebecca had foolishly believed she could walk away. She'd imagined she could expose his creative financial arrangements, those offshore accounts strategically hidden in the Cayman Islands. The notion was almost comical. She came from nothing, the daughter of a librarian. He'd plucked her from complete obscurity, transformed her into something worth displaying. She possessed no influential connections, no independent wealth, and most critically, no remaining will to fight. "Mr. Reynolds," Judge Harrison's voice boomed across the courtroom. The judge possessed a face resembling crumpled paper and had earned a reputation for despising anyone who wasted his valuable time. "Your legal representation has submitted a motion to completely dismiss the spousal support request based on documented evidence of marital infidelity. Is my understanding correct?" "Absolutely correct, Your Honor." Richard stood smoothly, straightening his jacket with practiced ease. "We've provided comprehensive documentation. Ms. Reynolds's multiple encounters at the Hotel Del Luna have been thoroughly verified and time-stamped. The accusation was fabricated, a beautiful, expensive lie." Matthew had compensated a private investigator $20,000 to manipulate photographs and manufacture a completely fictional digital evidence trail. Rebecca hadn't betrayed their marriage. In reality, she'd remained painfully faithful even while Matthew was sleeping with Tiffany, his executive assistant. But actual truth held no power in courtrooms. Only provable evidence mattered, and Matthew could purchase proof of absolutely anything. Rebecca's attorney, Sarah Jenkins, a severely overworked court-appointed public defender who appeared not to have slept properly in weeks, rose unsteadily to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. My client categorically denies these allegations. The photographs are deliberately grainy and prove absolutely nothing conclusive. This represents nothing more than a calculated character assassination." Judge Harrison exhaled heavily, massaging his temples with obvious frustration. He regarded Rebecca with an expression combining pity and irritation. "Ms. Jenkins, the digital timestamps corroborate the location claims. Unless you possess substantial evidence to effectively challenge the digital forensics presented, I'm prepared to accept this evidence as valid." Rebecca remained motionless, eyes fixed downward on her hands, fingers anxiously twisting a simple silver ring, not her wedding band, which she'd removed months earlier. "She's not even attempting to defend herself," Matthew whispered to Richard, grinning broadly. "It's absolutely pathetic." "It's finished," Richard whispered back confidently. "Watch this unfold." The judge shuffled his paperwork. "Considering the evidence presented and the plaintiff's complete absence of employment history throughout the duration of this marriage, this court is strongly inclined to uphold the prenuptial agreement in its complete and total entirety. Mr. Reynolds will retain exclusive ownership of the technology firm, the marital residence in the hills, and all liquid financial assets. Ms. Reynolds will receive the agreed-upon settlement of $20,000 and must vacate the premises within 48 hours. $20,000. The amount was deliberately insulting, insufficient to cover even 12 months of basic rent in this expensive city. It represented Matthew's final humiliation delivered to the woman who dedicated 5 years organizing his chaotic life, hosting his important business dinners, and supporting him through crippling anxiety attacks before his first $1 million success. Adrenaline flooded Matthew's system. He'd actually succeeded. He'd completely pulled it off. He stared at Rebecca, silently demanding she meet his gaze, desperately wanting to witness her tears, to see the crushing realization that she meant absolutely nothing without him. "Does either party have anything additional before I issue the final decree?" Judge Harrison asked, glancing obviously at the clock showing 11:55 a.m. The judge wanted his lunch break. "Nothing from our side, Your Honor," Richard responded smoothly. "Actually," Rebecca's attorney stammered nervously, "we respectfully request a continuance to re-examine the financial disclosure documents one more time." "Request denied," Harrison barked impatiently. "You've had 6 complete months, Ms. Jenkins. I'm issuing my ruling immediately." Matthew tapped his pen rhythmically against the polished table, a victorious staccato celebrating his absolute win. His mind was already planning the celebration. Tiffany waited in his car outside. They'd be flying to Cabo before sunset. "Very well," the judge announced, raising his gavel decisively. "In the matter of Reynolds versus Reynolds, I find conclusively in favor of the defendant, Matthew Reynolds. The divorce is hereby granted, and asset division is ordered as follows." The heavy wooden doors didn't simply open. They were violently thrust inward with such force the hinges shrieked in protest. The sound shattered the courtroom's quiet murmur like breaking glass. Every single head turned simultaneously. Even the court reporter's fingers froze mid-keystroke, hovering motionless above her machine. Standing framed in the doorway was an elderly man, perhaps late 60s, but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. He wore a charcoal suit clearly custom-made from fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He gripped a cane, not for physical support but wielded like a weapon, polished black wood topped with an ornate silver wolf's head. But his face commanded the room's complete attention. It was carved from years of impossibly difficult decisions, with eyes like flint chips that scanned the space with terrifying surgical precision. Two additional men in dark suits flanked him, carrying briefcases that resembled executioners' tools more than legal documents. "Who is that person?" Matthew whispered, annoyed by the dramatic interruption. "Security should have stopped him." Richard didn't respond. Matthew glanced sideways at his lawyer and was genuinely shocked to see every trace of color had drained from Richard's typically confident face. The arrogant shark suddenly resembled prey. "Richard, who is he?" Matthew hissed urgently. "Be quiet!" Richard snapped, his voice trembling noticeably. That shouldn't be possible." Judge Harrison, typically quick to eject anyone disrupting his courtroom, had frozen completely. His gavel remained suspended in midair, mouth hanging slightly open. Mr. Thornton?" the judge asked, his previously booming authority replaced by respectful, almost fearful uncertainty. The man in the doorway didn't immediately acknowledge anyone. He proceeded down the center aisle, his cane producing a rhythmic thud-thud-thud against the carpet. He didn't glance at Matthew. He didn't acknowledge the judge. He walked with singular purpose directly toward the plaintiff's table, toward Rebecca. Rebecca finally looked upward. For the first time all morning, her expression transformed completely. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't relief. It was a complicated mixture of shame and resigned acceptance. She rose slowly to her feet. "Hello, Father," she whispered quietly. "Father." Matthew's jaw dropped open in complete shock. He knew Rebecca's father. He'd encountered the man exactly once years ago at their wedding ceremony. A quiet, utterly unremarkable individual who'd claimed to be a retired state library archivist. He'd worn an ill-fitting rental tuxedo and had barely spoken 2 complete sentences to Matthew before departing early. Matthew had dismissed him as a complete nobody, a boring elderly man from the Midwest possessing zero ambition or significance. But the man dominating the courtroom now was definitely not an archivist. He radiated raw, undeniable power. The very air surrounding him crackled with dangerous authority. "Rebecca," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying effortlessly to the courtroom's farthest corners without any increase in volume. "You didn't call me." "I wanted to handle this independently," Rebecca said, her voice shaking noticeably. "And how precisely is that working for you?" The man, Magnus Thornton, gestured around the courtroom with his cane, taking in the smug husband, the expensive legal representation, and the weary judge. "It appears you're about to be completely devoured. Fortunately, I control the predators." Matthew couldn't remain silent any longer. This was absolutely ridiculous. "Excuse me," he stood abruptly, aggressively buttoning his jacket. "I don't know who you think you are barging into a legal proceeding, but this is a closed session. Judge, I demand this man be immediately removed." Richard reached up and yanked Matthew's sleeve violently downward. "Sit down, you absolute fool," Richard hissed, sweat visibly beading across his forehead. "What?" "No," Matthew pulled away indignantly. "Who is this guy? Rebecca's father is a librarian." Magnus Thornton finally directed his attention toward Matthew. The experience felt like a physical assault. Matthew's throat went completely dry. There was no anger in those eyes, only cold clinical assessment, like a butcher examining meat. "A librarian?" Magnus repeated, the corner of his mouth twitching slightly. "Yes, I suppose that's what I told you. I do appreciate maintaining detailed records. I keep extraordinarily comprehensive records." Magnus turned toward the bench. "Judge Harrison, it's been considerable time since the 1998 corruption trials, I believe." Judge Harrison swallowed hard, looking pale. "Mr. Thornton, I wasn't aware you were related to the plaintiff." "The name Reynolds," Magnus said with obvious distaste. She adopted his surname. A mistake we're here to correct. I'm entering representation on behalf of my daughter, Rebecca Thornton, and I'm bringing new legal counsel. He gestured to the men behind him. They stepped forward efficiently, placing briefcases on Rebecca's table. Sarah Jenkins appeared ready to faint. One man whispered something to her, handing her a check. Her eyes widened dramatically. She nodded frantically and grabbed her belongings, practically running from the courtroom. "This is completely irregular," Matthew shouted, though his confidence was clearly wavering. "You can't simply replace attorneys mid-verdict." "I can," Magnus said calmly. "And I just did, Your Honor." Matthew looked desperately to the judge for support. Judge Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Reynolds, given these unique circumstances and Mr. Thornton's presence, I'm granting a 1-hour recess." "A recess? You were literally about to rule," Matthew screamed. 1 hour! Harrison banged the gavel with finality and practically fled to his chambers, disappearing instantly. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Matthew turned on Richard furiously. "What the hell is happening? Who is he?" Richard was packing his briefcase with visibly shaking hands. "You told me her family was nobody, Matthew. You told me she came from absolutely nothing." "She did. Her father worked at a Chicago library." "Magnus Thornton didn't work at a library," Richard whispered, looking over his shoulder to ensure the old man wasn't listening. "Magnus Thornton owned the library, the land beneath it, and the construction company that built it." Richard leaned closer, eyes wide with terror. "Matthew, Magnus Thornton isn't a librarian. He was the lead federal prosecutor for the Southern District for 20 years before going private. He's the man who completely destroyed the Valetti crime family. They call him the Hammer. He's not just a lawyer, he's a legal executioner. He retired a decade ago and vanished. Everyone assumed he was dead." Matthew looked across the aisle. Rebecca sat with her head buried in her hands. Magnus stood over her protectively, one hand on her shoulder, speaking softly. The two new lawyers were already unpacking files, thick, ominous binders that looked absolutely terrifying. "So he was a prosecutor," Matthew scoffed, trying desperately to regain his composure. "So what? He's old. He's retired. The law is the law. We have the prenuptial agreement. We have evidence of her infidelity. He can't change actual facts." Richard looked at Matthew with genuine pity. "You don't understand. Men like Magnus Thornton don't enter courtrooms unless they already know the outcome. He didn't come here to argue your case, Matthew. He came here to completely bury you." Matthew looked back at Magnus. The old man looked up, catching Matthew's stare directly. Magnus didn't blink. He slowly raised his hand and made a simple gesture, tapping his index finger against his lips, silencing Matthew from across the entire room. Then Magnus smiled. It was absolutely terrifying, a shark's smile. "We need to settle," Richard said urgently. "Right now. We go over there immediately. We offer her half of everything. Maybe he'll let you keep the company." "Half?" Matthew laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. "I'm not giving that woman a single dime. I don't care who her father is. I'm Matthew Reynolds. I built this empire. Let the old man try. I'll crush him too." Matthew grabbed his phone and texted Tiffany. Slight delay. Old relative showed up. Annoying but harmless. Order another bottle of Dom. He had absolutely no idea that the phone in his hand was already compromised. He had no idea that the harmless old relative had spent the previous 48 hours systematically dismantling Matthew's entire life, brick by digital brick. The battle hadn't just begun. It was already finished. Matthew was simply the last person to realize it. The hour recess felt like 5 minutes to Matthew. When they re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes devastating storms. Magnus Thornton sat at the plaintiff's table, his large hands resting calmly on the polished wood. He didn't review notes. He didn't look at his daughter. He stared directly at Matthew with a predator's unblinking, patient, and terrifyingly confident gaze. Judge Harrison returned to the bench, and Matthew's world was about to completely collapse.